Eastern Front, July 1943. Major Hans Dietrich peered through the vision slit of his Panzer IV command tank, watching the long column of German armour stretching ahead and behind him on the narrow forest road. 43 tanks, half-tracks carrying infantry, supply trucks, and self-propelled artillery pieces, all moving in a tight formation through the dense birch forests southwest of Kursk. It was supposed to be a routine redeployment, moving his battalion from their assembly area to a new position on the southern flank of the great offensive that everyone was calling Operation Citadel. The road had been scouted by motorcycle reconnaissance units that morning. They had reported it clear, but Dietrich had been fighting the Soviets for 2 years, and he had learned that nothing was ever truly safe on the Eastern Front. The forest on either side of the road was thick with summer growth, the birch trees standing like pale sentinels with their distinctive white bark. Visibility into the tree line was limited to perhaps 30 or 40 metres before the undergrowth and tree trunks blocked any further view. The road itself was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, really just a dirt track that had been churned to mud by earlier traffic and then baked hard again by the summer sun. Deep ruts from previous vehicles made steering difficult, forcing the tanks to maintain a slow, steady pace. The sound of engines and clanking treads echoed through the forest, making it impossible to hear anything else. Dietrich didn't like it. The tactical situation felt wrong. They were strung out in a long, vulnerable column with limited ability to maneuver, surrounded by terrain that could hide an army. He keyed his radio to speak with his company commanders, reminding them to maintain proper spacing between vehicles and to keep their gunners alert. The responses came back routine and professional, but Dietrich could hear an edge in some of the voices. These men were veterans. They could feel it too, the sense of unease that came from moving through terrain where the enemy could be anywhere. They had all seen what Soviet ambushes could do. They had all lost friends to concealed anti-tank guns that would open fire at point-blank range and then vanish before the Germans could respond. They had all experienced the terror of fighting an enemy that seemed to materialize out of the ground itself. What Dietrich did not know, what he could not have known, was that 3 battalions of Soviet infantry, supported by a regiment of anti-tank guns and a company of T-34 tanks, had been lying in wait on either side of this road for 18 hours. They had been warned of the German movement by partisan scouts and had moved into position during the night, digging in their guns and deploying their infantry in carefully prepared positions that were invisible from the road. Over 3,000 Soviet soldiers were concealed in the forest on either side of the German column, and they had been given strict orders: let the entire column enter the kill zone, let them think they are safe, then destroy them all. The Soviet commander, Colonel Mikhail Volkov, watched through binoculars from his command post on a slight rise about 200 metres back from the road. He could see the German tanks moving past, could see the commanders standing in their open hatches, could see the infantry and the half-tracks looking tired and bored. They suspected nothing. His anti-tank guns were positioned in a pattern that would create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that every metre of the road was covered by at least 2 guns. His infantry were in foxholes and trenches, ready to emerge and attack any Germans who survived the initial barrage. His T-34 tanks were held in reserve, positioned to block any German attempt to retreat back the way they had come. Volkov had been planning this ambush for 2 days, ever since the partisan message had arrived warning of German armour moving along this particular road. He had studied the terrain personally, walking the length of the kill zone and selecting each gun position himself. He had positioned his strongest guns, the 76mm divisional guns that could penetrate the armour of any German tank, at the head and tail of the ambush zone to disable the lead and trailing vehicles immediately. This would trap the column between them. The lighter 45mm anti-tank guns were positioned along the flanks to engage the vehicles caught in the middle. He had pre-registered all the gun positions on specific points along the road, so his gunners would know exactly where to aim without needing to expose themselves to acquire targets. The entire German column had to be inside the kill zone before the ambush was sprung. Volkov watched patiently as tank after tank rolled past his concealed positions. He counted them mentally, comparing his count to the intelligence reports. The partisans had said a battalion, which meant 30 to 40 tanks plus supporting vehicles. He needed all of them committed before he gave the signal. If he fired too soon, some would escape. If he waited too long, the lead elements might exit the kill zone before he could trap them. Timing was everything. Dietrich's command tank was approximately in the middle of the column, which put him in the worst possible position when the ambush was triggered. The first indication that something was wrong came not from any tactical awareness but from pure chance. One of Dietrich's crew members, the radio operator, happened to be looking out his vision slit at exactly the right moment and the right angle to see sunlight glinting off metal in the tree line. He shouted a warning, but even as the words left his mouth, the forest on both sides of the road erupted in fire. The Soviet gunners had been given the signal by a single red flare arcing into the sky. They opened fire simultaneously and the effect was catastrophic. The lead German tank, a Panzer IV about 600 meters ahead of Dietrich's position, took 3 hits within the first 2 seconds. One round punched through the turret, killing the commander who had been standing in the open hatch. Another struck the hull front at a slight angle and penetrated, igniting the ammunition stored inside. The third hit the track and suspension, immobilizing the vehicle even as it began to burn. The crew tried to bail out, but Soviet machine gun fire from the tree line cut them down as they emerged from the hatches. The trailing vehicle, another Panzer IV at the rear of the column, was similarly destroyed within seconds. Multiple anti-tank guns had been aimed at it, and at least 4 rounds struck it almost simultaneously. The tank exploded as its fuel and ammunition detonated together, the turret flipping up and off the hull in a shower of flames and debris. The column was trapped, exactly as Volkov had planned. German tanks and vehicles were now bunched together on a narrow road, with burning wrecks blocking both ends and Soviet anti-tank guns firing from concealed positions on both flanks. Dietrich's training and combat experience took over immediately. He dropped into the turret and began shouting orders over the radio, even as his own tank shuddered from the impact of a round that fortunately hit at an angle and deflected off the sloped armour. He ordered all tanks to immediately return fire into the tree lines where muzzle flashes were visible. He ordered the infantry half-tracks to get their men dismounted and into cover. He ordered the column to close up and prepare to assault through the ambush in whatever direction seemed to offer the best chance of escape. But executing these orders was almost impossible in the chaos that had engulfed the column. The road was too narrow for tanks to turn around. Vehicles were blocking each other. The Soviet anti-tank fire was so intense and accurate that tanks were being hit faster than they could identify targets and return fire. The distinctive crack boom of Soviet 76mm guns echoed through the forest, followed milliseconds later by the clang of metal on metal as rounds struck German armour. Some rounds penetrated, others deflected. But the sheer volume of fire meant that the Germans were taking casualties faster than they could inflict them. German tank commanders who were standing in their open hatches for better visibility were cut down by Soviet snipers and machine gunners positioned in the trees. This forced the surviving commanders to button up, closing their hatches and relying entirely on their limited vision slits. This reduced their situational awareness dramatically, making it even harder to coordinate a response. Some tanks managed to fire back, and when they scored hits on Soviet anti-tank gun positions, the results were devastating. A high explosive round from a 75mm tank gun would obliterate an anti-tank gun and its crew in a shower of earth and shrapnel. But for every Soviet gun that was destroyed, there seemed to be 2 more firing from different positions. The German infantry who had been riding in the half-tracks were in an even worse position than the tank crews. The half-tracks were lightly armoured, designed to protect against small arms fire and shell fragments, but completely vulnerable to anti-tank rounds and heavy machine gun fire. Several half-tracks were hit in the opening seconds of the ambush and immediately caught fire, the fuel tanks igniting and turning the vehicles into death traps for the men inside. Other half-tracks managed to get their infantry dismounted before being destroyed, but these soldiers now found themselves in the middle of a forest where every tree might conceal an enemy. The German infantry tried to form defensive positions using the disabled vehicles as cover, but Soviet infantrymen were emerging from concealed positions and engaging them at close range. What had been an armour column was rapidly fragmenting into dozens of separate small unit actions, as Germans and Soviets fought each other in the confusing tangle of forest undergrowth, burning vehicles, and smoke. The noise was overwhelming, a constant roar of tank guns, machine guns, small arms fire, shouted orders, and the screams of wounded men. The smoke from burning vehicles was beginning to create a pall over the entire scene, reducing visibility and adding to the confusion. Dietrich was trying to maintain command and control of his battalion, but it was becoming impossible. Radio discipline had broken down as panicked voices filled the frequencies with reports of casualties and requests for orders. He could hear his company commanders trying to organize their units, but the tactical situation was so chaotic that coherent action was nearly impossible. His own tank was maneuvering desperately in the limited space available, trying to find cover behind other vehicles while searching for targets in the tree line. His gunner managed to get off several shots at visible muzzle flashes, but whether they hit anything was unclear. Volkov watched the carnage unfolding from his command post with grim satisfaction. The ambush had worked exactly as planned. The Germans were trapped and taking severe casualties. His anti-tank gunners were doing their job superbly, working their guns with the speed and efficiency that came from years of combat experience. Load, aim, fire, reload. Many of these gunners had been fighting since 1941 and had learned their craft destroying German tanks in dozens of previous battles. They knew how to use terrain for concealment, how to fire and immediately shift position before German return fire could find them, how to aim for the vulnerable spots on German armour. The T-34 tanks that Volkov had held in reserve were now moving into position to block any German attempt to retreat. These 12 tanks manoeuvred through the forest, on paths that had been scouted earlier, approaching the German column from the rear where the destroyed trailing vehicle had originally sealed off that direction. Their appearance would complete the encirclement and eliminate any hope the Germans might have of fighting their way back to friendly lines. The T-34s were not the newest or best Soviet tanks, but they were reliable and well suited to this kind of close-range forest fighting, where their superior numbers and knowledge of the terrain would offset German advantages in gun quality and armour protection. Dietrich finally managed to organise a local counterattack with the tanks immediately around his position. 5 Panzer V's, his own command tank and 4 others that were still operational, formed up and assaulted directly into the tree line on the left side of the road, where the Soviet fire seemed to be most concentrated. It was a desperate move, but staying on the road meant certain death as Soviet anti-tank guns methodically destroyed every vehicle. The tanks crashed through the undergrowth, their treads tearing up the forest floor, their guns firing high explosive rounds into the trees ahead of them. Several Soviet anti-tank gun positions were overrun and destroyed, the German tanks simply running over the guns and crushing them into the earth. For a brief moment it seemed like this aggressive action might create an opening for the column to escape. German infantry rallied behind the advancing tanks, using them as mobile cover while they engaged Soviet infantrymen with rifles and machine guns. The Soviet defensive line in this sector was buckling under the concentrated German assault. But then the Soviet reserve infantry companies that Volkov had positioned specifically to deal with this kind of breakthrough moved forward and engaged. These were not ordinary rifle troops, but Guards infantry, experienced soldiers equipped with anti-tank rifles, satchel charges and Molotov cocktails designed specifically for close-range tank fighting. The Soviet Guards infantry allowed the German tanks to penetrate deep into their positions and then swarmed them from multiple directions. Anti-tank riflemen fired at the vulnerable rear armour and engine compartments of the Panzer Fools. Other soldiers threw Molotov cocktails that shattered on the tanks' hulls and sprayed burning gasoline over the engine decks. Satchel charges were thrown onto the rear decks and into the engine compartments, detonating and causing catastrophic damage. Within 5 minutes of penetrating the Soviet lines, 3 of the 5 German tanks were burning wrecks, and the other 2 were forced to retreat back to the road or risk being destroyed. Dietrich's own tank was one of those forced to retreat. His vehicle had taken multiple hits, none penetrating but all causing damage. His radio antenna had been shot away, cutting off his communication with the rest of the battalion. His driver had been wounded by fragments that had penetrated through the driver's vision slit. 1. Track was damaged and threatening to throw itself off at any moment. The tank was barely functional, and Dietrich knew it was only a matter of time before a Soviet anti-tank round found a weak spot and punched through. He made the agonizing decision to abandon the vehicle and try to escape on foot with his crew. All across the ambush site, similar decisions were being made by German tank commanders. Some vehicles were so badly damaged they were clearly beyond recovery. Others might have been repairable if given time and a secure environment, but neither was available. Crews were bailing out of their disabled tanks and trying to form infantry defensive positions or infiltrate through the Soviet lines in small groups. Some succeeded in escaping into the forest and eventually making it back to German lines days or even weeks later, with harrowing stories of moving through Soviet-held territory. Others were killed or captured within minutes of abandoning their vehicles. The battle, if it could still be called that rather than a massacre, continued for nearly 2 hours from the moment the ambush was sprung. The German column, which had consisted of 43 armoured vehicles and numerous soft-skinned trucks and support vehicles, was completely destroyed. Of the 43 tanks and assault guns, 37 were total losses, burned out or so badly damaged they could never be recovered. 6 managed to escape, though 4 of those were damaged to varying degrees. Of the supporting vehicles, fewer than a third escaped. The German casualties were catastrophic. Over 400 men were killed in the ambush and the subsequent fighting. Another 200 were wounded, many seriously. 150 were taken prisoner, mostly men who had been trapped with no way to escape and had chosen surrender over certain death. The Soviet casualties were significantly lighter, but still substantial. Volkov lost 8 anti-tank guns destroyed by German return fire, with their crews killed or wounded. His infantry units took casualties from German small arms fire and tank gun rounds, with estimates suggesting around 120 killed and 200 wounded. 2 of his T-34 tanks were damaged, one by a lucky shot from a retreating Panzer IV that managed to hit it at close range, another by mechanical failure. But these losses were considered acceptable given the scale of the German defeat. An entire German armoured battalion had been effectively destroyed, removing a significant combat formation from the order of battle at a critical moment in the Kursk offensive. The tactical principles that made this ambush successful are worth examining because they represent lessons that have been learned and relearned throughout military history. The Soviets achieved surprise through careful concealment and patience. They established a kill zone with multiple overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that targets could not escape by manoeuvring. They blocked both ends of the ambush site to trap the enemy column. They had reserves positioned to counterattack any German breakthrough attempts. They maintained fire discipline and command control throughout the engagement. These are the fundamental elements of a successful ambush, and the Soviets executed them nearly flawlessly. From the German perspective, this ambush represented a catastrophic failure of reconnaissance and tactical awareness. The motorcycle reconnaissance units that had scouted the road that morning had been looking for obvious signs of enemy activity like vehicle tracks or troop movements on the road itself. They had not conducted a thorough search of the forest on either side of the road, which would have required dismounting and moving through the undergrowth on foot. This was understandable given the time constraints and the dangers of such operations, but it meant they missed the concealed Soviet positions. The column had been moving without adequate flank security, with no infantry scouts moving parallel to the road through the forest to detect ambushes. This was a violation of basic tactical doctrine, but was unfortunately common in situations where speed was prioritized over security. The narrow, confined nature of the road had made the German column extremely vulnerable. Tanks are powerful weapons when they have room to maneuver and can use their superior range and armor protection, but in a narrow defile where they cannot turn around or deploy in proper battle formation, they become vulnerable targets. The Germans should have recognized this danger and either chosen a different route or reinforced the column with additional infantry to secure the flanks. The fact that they did neither suggests either overconfidence in their security situation or pressure from higher command to move quickly without adequate precautions. The speed with which the situation deteriorated once the ambush was sprung demonstrated how vulnerable even armoured formations could be when caught in an unfavourable tactical situation. The first vehicles hit were the lead and trailing tanks, which immediately trapped the entire column. This is standard ambush doctrine, and the Germans should have anticipated it and had plans in place to respond. Some German units in Russia had developed techniques for dealing with ambushes, including immediate violent assault in one direction to break through the ambush line, or dispersing into the terrain and reassembling at a pre-planned rally point. But Dietrich's battalion does not appear to have had such contingency plans, or if they did, the shock and confusion of the initial moments prevented their execution. The personal experience of Major Dietrich after abandoning his tank provides insight into the chaos and terror of infantry combat in the forests of Russia. He gathered his crew of 4 other men and attempted to move east through the forest back toward German lines. They moved cautiously, trying to avoid Soviet patrols while navigating through terrain that all looked the same. The forest was a maze of birch trees and undergrowth with no clear landmarks. They could hear firing behind them as the battle continued, and occasionally they would hear Soviet troops moving through the forest searching for German survivors. At one point they came across a group of about 15 other German soldiers who had also escaped from the ambush. Dietrich, as the senior officer, took command of this group and led them in a careful infiltration through the Soviet rear areas. They moved primarily at night, hiding during the day in whatever concealment they could find. They had no food except what they could scavenge from their emergency rations. Water was available from streams, but they had to be careful because Soviet troops used the same water sources. They went 3 days without encountering any other humans, moving slowly and carefully through the endless forest. On the 4th day, they stumbled into a Soviet supply column moving along a forest track. The encounter was sudden and unexpected, with both sides surprised. A brief, vicious firefight erupted at ranges of less than 20 meters. Dietrich was wounded in the shoulder by a rifle bullet, but managed to lead his group away from the Soviet troops in the confusion. They left 4 men behind, dead or too badly wounded to move. The remaining 11 continued their escape, now aware that they were in the middle of Soviet-held territory with enemy units all around them. They finally reached German lines 6 days after the ambush, having covered over 40 kilometers through hostile territory. Of the original group Dietrich had gathered, only 7 survived to make it back. The others had been killed in the encounter with the Soviet supply column or had died from wounds during the journey. Dietrich himself was hospitalized for 3 weeks to recover from his wound and from exhaustion and malnutrition. When he was finally debriefed by intelligence officers, his account of the ambush became one of the most detailed records of what had happened that day. The broader strategic context of this ambush is important for understanding its significance. Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk, was intended to be a massive pincer movement that would encircle and destroy a huge Soviet salient. The Germans were committing nearly 1 million men and thousands of tanks and aircraft to this operation, which Hitler believed would regain the initiative on the Eastern Front after the disaster at Stalingrad. Every armoured battalion was critical to the success of the offensive. Losing an entire battalion to ambush before it even reached its designated attack position was a blow that the Germans could not easily absorb. The Soviets, for their part, had been preparing for this offensive for months. Soviet intelligence had provided detailed warnings about German intentions, and the Red Army had spent the spring and early summer preparing defensive positions in depth. The ambush of Dietrich's battalion was just one of many actions the Soviets took to disrupt German preparations and reduce the forces available for the offensive. Soviet partisan units were conducting raids behind German lines, attacking supply columns and railroads. Soviet air power was striking German assembly areas, and as the ambush demonstrated, Soviet ground forces were using terrain and tactical skill to destroy German units piecemeal before they could concentrate for the main attack. The psychological impact of the ambush on German forces in the area was significant. Word spread quickly through the German ranks about what had happened to Dietrich's battalion. Soldiers who had previously felt relatively safe moving through rear areas now understood that nowhere was truly secure. The Soviets could be anywhere, and they were willing and able to destroy even strong German formations if they caught them in the right circumstances. This created a climate of fear and uncertainty that affected German operations throughout the region. For the Soviet forces, the ambush was a tremendous morale boost. Volkov and his men had destroyed an entire German armoured battalion with relatively light casualties. The victory was publicized through Soviet military publications and propaganda, with Volkov being awarded the Order of the Red Banner and being promoted to command of a division. His anti-tank gunners received decorations and were held up as examples of Soviet tactical prowess. The captured German tanks and equipment were displayed for propaganda purposes, photographed and filmed for newsreels that would be shown throughout the Soviet Union. The technical details of how the Soviets prepared and executed the ambush reveal the level of professionalism and tactical sophistication that the Red Army had developed by mid-1943. This was not the same army that had nearly been destroyed in 1941 when the Germans first invaded. That army had been gutted by Stalin's purges, poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly led. But by 1943, the survivors of those early catastrophic battles had learned hard lessons, and the Soviet military-industrial system was producing weapons in enormous quantities. The Red Army was becoming a formidable fighting force capable of matching and often exceeding German tactical capabilities. The anti-tank guns that formed the backbone of the ambush were a mix of weapons. The most numerous were the 45mm M1942 anti-tank guns, which were light enough to be manhandled into position by their crews and could be well concealed in forest terrain. These guns were not powerful enough to reliably penetrate the frontal armour of German medium tanks like the Panzer IV, but they were effective against side and rear armour at the ranges encountered in the ambush. The Soviets had learned to position these guns to catch German tanks from the flank where they were most vulnerable. The heavier 76mm divisional guns were more powerful and could penetrate German tank armour from almost any angle at the ranges involved. These guns were positioned at the head and tail of the ambush zone specifically because their firepower was needed to quickly disable the lead and trailing vehicles and seal the trap. These guns were also more difficult to conceal and position because of their greater weight and size, which is why Volkov had used them more sparingly than the lighter 45mm guns. The Soviet infantry involved in the ambush were organised in standard rifle battalions with typical Soviet weapons of the period. Most infantrymen carried the Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifle, a weapon that dated back to the 1890s but was still effective for the ranges typically encountered in forest combat. Squad automatic weapons were provided by the PPSH-41 submachine gun, which had a high rate of fire and was ideal for close-range combat in terrain with limited visibility. Each rifle company had a machine gun platoon with Maxim heavy machine guns, which were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire covering the road and approaches. The specialised anti-tank infantry who dealt with Dietrich's attempted breakthrough were equipped with PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles. These were large, heavy weapons that fired a 14.5mm armour-piercing round capable of penetrating the rear and side armour of German tanks at close range. The rifles had tremendous recoil and were difficult to use effectively, but in the hands of trained soldiers they were capable of disabling tanks by damaging engines, fuel tanks, and other vulnerable components. The Soviets had also developed specialised satchel charges that combined multiple blocks of TNT with an impact or timed fuse. These were thrown onto tank engine decks or pushed into tank tracks, where they would detonate and cause catastrophic damage. The Molotov cocktails used by Soviet infantry were simple but effective weapons against tanks in close combat. They consisted of glass bottles filled with gasoline or other flammable liquid, with a rag soaked in the same liquid stuffed into the neck of the bottle. The rag would be lit and the bottle thrown at the tank, where it would shatter and spray burning liquid over the target. If the liquid reached the engine compartment or any other area with exposed fuel or ammunition, it could start fires that would force the crew to abandon the vehicle or result in catastrophic explosions. The psychological effect was also significant, as tank crews were terrified of being burned alive inside their vehicles. The T-34 tanks that Volkov deployed to complete the encirclement were the standard Soviet medium tank of the war. By 1943 standards they were not particularly advanced, and their armour and gun were roughly equivalent to the German Panzer IV. But they had several advantages in this particular situation. They were more mobile in soft terrain than German tanks, with wider tracks, that distributed weight better and prevented them from bogging down. Their diesel engines were more reliable and less prone to catching fire than the gasoline engines in German tanks, and most importantly, they were available in large numbers while German tanks were increasingly rare and precious. The Soviet command and control during the ambush was maintained through a combination of pre-planned instructions and flexible response to changing situations. Volkov had given his subordinate commanders detailed orders before the ambush was sprung, specifying which units were responsible for which sectors, what their objectives were, and what they should do in various contingencies. Once the fighting began, radio communication was difficult because of the noise and chaos, so subordinate commanders had to execute their orders using their own judgment and initiative. This required well-trained officers and NCOs who understood their commander's intent and could adapt to circumstances. The Soviets also made effective use of signal flares for communication during the ambush. Different coloured flares had pre-arranged meanings, allowing Volkov to send simple commands to his units even when radio communication was impossible. A red flare meant commence the attack. A green flare would signal the reserve units to move forward. A white flare would indicate that friendly forces were in a particular area and should not be fired upon. This system was simple but effective and had been developed through hard experience in earlier battles where Soviet units had sometimes fired on each other in the confusion of combat. The aftermath of the ambush saw both sides trying to extract lessons and adjust their tactics. For the Germans, the immediate response was to strengthen reconnaissance procedures for columns moving through forested terrain. Orders were issued requiring more thorough scouting of routes, including dismounted infantry patrols checking the terrain on either side of roads. Columns were to move with stronger flank security, with infantry and reconnaissance vehicles paralleling the main body at a distance sufficient to detect ambushes before the main force was engaged. Tank spacing in column was increased to reduce the number of vehicles that could be caught in an ambush kill zone simultaneously. But implementing these measures was difficult given the operational tempo of the Kursk offensive and the shortage of troops and vehicles. German commanders were under intense pressure to move forces quickly to their designated positions, and thorough security measures took time that was not available. The result was that German columns continued to suffer ambushes throughout the Kursk battle, though none were as catastrophic as the one that destroyed Dietrich's battalion. The cumulative effect of these losses was to significantly reduce German combat power before the main attacks even began. The Soviets expanded their ambush program based on the success of this, and similar operations. More anti-tank guns were allocated to units operating in the German rear areas. Partisan forces were given better intelligence about German movements and were provided with more weapons and supplies to enable them to conduct larger-scale operations. The Soviet General Staff studied the tactics used in successful ambushes and disseminated that information throughout the Red Army, through training bulletins and tactical directives. Ambush became a standard Soviet tactic for dealing with German armour in terrain that limited German mobility advantages. The long-term impact of this particular ambush extended beyond the immediate tactical results. The destruction of an entire German armoured battalion was documented by Soviet combat cameramen who arrived at the scene shortly after the fighting ended. Photographs and film footage of the destroyed German column were used extensively in Soviet propaganda, both domestically and internationally. These images showed destroyed German tanks burning, abandoned equipment scattered along the road, and Soviet soldiers examining captured weapons. The message was clear. The supposedly invincible German Wehrmacht could be defeated by superior Soviet tactics and the courage of Soviet soldiers. For historians studying the Eastern Front, this ambush represents a microcosm of how the nature of the war was changing in 1943. The early years of the war had been characterized by German tactical and operational superiority, with Soviet forces suffering catastrophic defeats despite their numerical advantages. But by 1943, the Soviets had learned from their mistakes and were fielding armies that could match German forces in tactics, equipment quality, and leadership. The ambush demonstrated Soviet mastery of combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, anti-tank guns, and armour in a coordinated operation that exploited German vulnerabilities. The personal stories of individual soldiers involved in the ambush provide additional depth to our understanding of the event. Soviet Private Alexei Morozov was a gunner on one of the 76mm anti-tank guns positioned at the head of the kill zone. His gun fired the shot that disabled the lead German tank, and he and his crew went on to claim 4 more tank kills during the battle before their gun was destroyed by German return fire. Morozov survived and was awarded the Order of Glory. Years later he recounted his memories of the ambush, describing the tension of waiting for the signal to fire, the thunderous noise of the battle and the grim satisfaction of seeing German tanks burning. German Sergeant Wilhelm Becker was a squad leader in one of the infantry half-tracks caught in the ambush. He survived the initial fusillade of anti-tank fire and managed to get his squad dismounted and into cover behind a destroyed truck. They fought for over an hour against Soviet infantry, expending all their ammunition before finally being forced to surrender. Becker spent the rest of the war in Soviet prison camps and was not repatriated to Germany until 1949. His memoir, written in the 1960s, provides a detailed account of the terror and confusion of the ambush from an infantry perspective and the subsequent years of captivity. Soviet Lieutenant Dmitry Kuznetsov commanded one of the T-34 tanks that blocked the German retreat. His tank was hit by a German anti-tank round that penetrated the turret and killed his gunner, but Kuznetsov and the rest of his crew survived. He continued to command his tank throughout the engagement despite being wounded and was subsequently awarded the Order of the Red Star. His after-action report provides valuable information about the movement and positioning of the Soviet tank reserve and how they coordinated with the infantry and anti-tank gun units. The weapons and equipment captured from the destroyed German column were extensively studied by Soviet technical intelligence personnel. Several of the destroyed Panzer IV tanks were examined to understand their construction and identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future engagements. Documents found on German officers provided information about German unit organization, operational plans, and the overall situation on the Kursk front. This intelligence was valuable for Soviet planning in the subsequent phases of the battle. The location of the ambush became something of a pilgrimage site for Soviet soldiers and civilians during and after the war. The destroyed German vehicles were left where they had been knocked out, slowly rusting and decaying in the forest. Local residents would visit the site to see the evidence of Soviet victory. After the war, some of the destroyed tanks were recovered and placed in museums or used as monuments. The ambush site itself was eventually cleared of wreckage, but even today local residents can identify the approximate location and occasionally find artifacts from the battle in the forest. The tactical analysis of the ambush has been the subject of numerous military studies in the decades since the war. Staff colleges in various countries have used it as a case study for teaching ambush tactics and counter-ambush procedures. The basic principles demonstrated in the ambush remain relevant despite enormous changes in military technology. The importance of reconnaissance, the vulnerability of columns moving through restrictive terrain, the value of combined arms coordination, the need for rapid and decisive action when ambushed. These lessons are as applicable today as they were in 1943. Modern armies have developed sophisticated countermeasures to ambushes, including aerial reconnaissance, electronic warfare to detect enemy communications and preparations, armoured column escort procedures, and quick reaction forces that can rapidly reinforce ambushed units. But even with all these modern capabilities, ambushes remain a dangerous threat, particularly in terrain like forests, mountains, or urban areas where visibility and maneuverability are limited. The fundamental dynamics that made the 1943 ambush so effective, achieving surprise, exploiting terrain, using overwhelming firepower in a short time window, remain central to ambush tactics. The day the Soviets ambushed an entire German armoured column southwest of Kursk in July 1943 was not a turning point in the war in the sense of being a single decisive battle. The Eastern Front was too vast and the forces involved too enormous for any single tactical action to be truly decisive. But it was representative of a larger turning point that was occurring across the front. The Soviets were no longer the hapless victims of German operational art. They had become skilled, dangerous opponents who could match German forces in tactical proficiency and exceed them in numbers and material resources. The ambush was a small-scale example of the larger transformation that would eventually lead to Soviet victory in the war. For Major Dietrich and the hundreds of German soldiers who died or were captured that day, it was a personal catastrophe. For the Soviet soldiers who planned and executed the ambush, it was a proud achievement. For historians and military professionals studying the Eastern Front, it remains a valuable case study in the brutal reality of mechanized warfare in terrain that negated many of the advantages that armoured forces typically possessed.